Lucas, Clara began, her voice trembling as she stepped out from Dominic's shadow. It isn't what it looks like, isn't it? Lucas's voice was a jagged whisper, a sound of absolute heartbreak. He looked from the blood on Clara's palms to the way Dominic refused to let go of her. I sent her away to keep her out of this bloodbath, Dominic. I trusted you to keep the distance. I trusted you with my family. I am her family. Dominic's voice erupted, a low roar that vibrated with the weight of a decade's worth of restraint. He stepped forward, putting himself between the siblings, his presence a wall of charcoal silk and iron will. I've spent 9 years playing the martyr for a debt I never owed you, Lucas. I watched her leave, I watched her cry, and I stayed silent while my own life turned to ash just to keep your trust intact. But she almost died tonight, and I am done letting you decide who she belongs to. The three-way tension in the room was a physical cord, stretched to the point of snapping. Lucas looked at his sister, not as the child he needed to protect, but as the woman who had just risked her life to save a man he now barely recognized. He saw the resolve in her gaze, the way she didn't flinch away from the carnage or the man standing at the center of it. "You knew," Lucas said, his gaze returning to Dominic. "All those years, when we were building this empire, you were just waiting for her to come back." "I was surviving until she came back," Dominic corrected, his jaw set in a lethal line. "Now you have a choice, Lucas. The Martinez syndicate is at our gates. We can fight this war as brothers, or we can let this betrayal burn down everything we've built. But make no mistake, she stays with me." Lucas looked at the fallen assassin, then at the locked door, and finally at the twin girls' portraits on the far wall. The family was a fractured thing, held together by blood and secrets. He took a long, shuddering breath, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of a kingdom hanging in the balance. Slowly, he holstered his weapon and turned toward the monitors. "Then we better make sure there's a city left to rule," he rasped, the choice made, even if the forgiveness was miles away. The command center of the Thorn estate was bathed in the clinical blue light of a dozen monitors, but the atmosphere remained heavy with the residual smoke of the ambush. Lucas was occupied at a distant terminal, his silhouette a rigid reminder of the fragile peace they had brokered. In the center of the room, Dominic stood before Clara, his charcoal vest discarded and his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. The Ice King looked less like a monarch and more like a man who had stared into the abyss and realized it wasn't the heights of power he feared losing, but the woman standing in front of him. "The Martinez hit wasn't just about territory, Clara. It was about leverage. They saw the way I looked at you at the gala. They saw the one thing I wasn't willing to lose, and they turned it into a target." Clara looked at the blood staining his cuffs, her blood, and felt the shift in the air. The man who had once used mafia power moves to assert his dominance was gone. In his place was someone raw, stripped of the unreadable mask he had worn for a decade. "I spent 9 years building this empire so I would never have to bow to anyone again," Dominic continued, stepping into her space, his gray eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "I thought the Thorn name was a shield, but if being the King of New York means I have to watch you take bullets intended for me, then the crown is worthless." He reached out, his fingers ghosting over the bandage on her palm, his touch lighter than it had ever been. "I'll change the rules, Clara. I'll dismantle the Thorn Syndicate's interest in the ports. I'll hand the South Brooklyn territory to the council. I'll even step down if that's what it takes to take the red dot off your heart.
I'm not asking you to be a part of my world anymore. I'm offering to change the world until it's safe enough for you." The weight of the offer hung in the air, a staggering reversal of everything Dominic Thorne stood for. For a man defined by control, offering to surrender his empire was the ultimate submission. Clara looked up at him, seeing the steel-gray eyes softened by a vulnerability she had never thought possible. The power had shifted. He wasn't the boss commanding a ward. He was a man offering his kingdom for a future he had once thought forbidden. "You don't have to step down, Dominic," Clara whispered, her hand closing over his. "If the rules don't work for us, then we'll be the ones to break them." The snow fell in silent, crystalline drifts over the Thorne estate, blanketing the dark history of the past few months in a layer of pure, shimmering white. Under the vast expanse of the annuary sky, the stars blazed with a cold, brilliant clarity, witnessing a scene that the city of New York had whispered about but never truly expected to see. Dominic Thorne, the man who had spent a lifetime avoiding the vulnerability of a heart, stood at the edge of the glass-enclosed conservatory, his intense gray eyes fixed not on the horizon of his empire, but on the woman walking towards him. Clara moved with a quiet, reclaimed grace, her white silk gown trailing behind her like a fallen cloud. She was no longer the ghost in the hallways or the ward hidden in the shadows of her brother's memory. As she reached Dominic, she saw the Ice King offer her a hand that was steady, warm, and entirely hers. Beside them, Lucas stood as the best man, his face etched with a complex, hard-won peace. He had finally accepted that protecting his sister meant not keeping her from the fire, but standing by her as she learned to command it. Even the twins, Leela and Lena, stood at the front, their eyes wide with the magic of the evening. Leela held a bouquet of winter roses, her soft features glowing, while Lena watched the perimeter with that same quiet, observant focus she had inherited from the world they lived in. They were the future of this house, the emotional anchors that had finally grounded the restless soul of the Thorne syndicate. Dominic took Clara's hands in his, the weight of his signet ring pressing against her skin, a symbol of the power he was no longer wielding against her, but sharing with her. There were no grand oaths of traditional service, only the low, gravelly vow of a man who had realized that his greatest strength lay in the woman who was brave enough to save him from himself. "I spent 9 years running," Clara whispered, her voice a soft melody against the winter wind. "The flight is over, Clara. You aren't just a Vance anymore. You are a Thorne, and this city will finally learn what it means to answer to a queen." As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife under the watchful January stars, the deadly game reached its final, beautiful resolution. The restraint was gone, the betrayal was buried, and the ruthless boss had finally found the only thing more powerful than his empire: a home. Clara looked out at the lights of the city she once feared, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't feel like a victim of the underworld. She was its heart, and in Dominic's arms, she was finally, perfectly, exactly where she belonged.
"I sent you away to keep you whole." Dominic's composure finally cracked, his voice rising with a raw, jagged edge that made Clara flinch. He pushed off the door, closing the distance between them in 2 predatory strides. "I sent you away because every time I looked at you, I forgot the code I lived by. I forgot your brother's trust. I was drowning, Clara, and the only way to breathe was to put an ocean between us." "And now?" Clara challenged, her eyes flashing with a decade of suppressed fury. She didn't back away. She stepped into his space, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs it felt like it might break. You bring me back here, you trap me in boardrooms, you mark me in front of your men, and you think that makes us even? You think 9 years of silence just vanishes because you've decided you're tired of being alone? Dominic grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but not painful, grounding her as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. I've never been alone, Clara. I've been haunted. Every woman I looked at, every deal I made, every night I spent staring at the New York skyline, I saw you. I saw the girl from the garden, and God help me, I see the woman now. He pulled her closer until the heat radiating from him was a suffocating magnetic force. Clara's breath hitched, the dossiers slipping from her hands and scattering across the floor like falling leaves. The anger in her eyes softened into something much more dangerous, a mirror of his own desperation. "You haven't moved on," Dominic whispered, his face inches from hers, his gray eyes searching hers for the lie he knew he wouldn't find. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't feel the same fire that's been burning me alive for 9 years. Clara didn't answer with words. She couldn't. The truth was written in the way she leaned into him, her fingers finally tangling in the silk of his vest. The lock on the door was no longer a cage, it was a sanctuary. In the silence of the locked room, the Ice King and his ghost finally recognized that the only thing more lethal than the Martinez syndicate was the love they had both failed to outrun. The night air shattered with the sudden jagged roar of an engine and the high-pitched whine of a motorcycle cutting through the stillness of the Thorne Estate's perimeter. Dominic and Clara were still locked in the heavy atmosphere of the study, the truth of their shared history lingering between them like a physical touch, when the first round of gunfire tore through the reinforced glass of the tall windows. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of violence. Dominic moved with a lethal, practiced fluidity, his hand reaching for the holster at the small of his back before the glass had even finished hitting the floor. He didn't shout, he didn't panic, he simply grabbed Clara by the waist and threw her behind the heavy mahogany desk, his body acting as a human shield until she was safely in the shadows of the dark wood. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through the sound of the alarm now blaring through the mansion. Clara huddled on the floor, the scent of expensive bourbon and gunpowder filling her lungs. Through the gap between the desk and the wall, she saw the Ice King in his element. Dominic was a silhouette of controlled fury, returning fire toward the garden where the red laser dots of the Martinez assassins were dancing across the walls. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned down, yet he stood his ground with the iron-spined defiance that had built his empire. Then she saw the shift. A second shooter appeared on the balcony above the study, his rifle leveled at the back of Dominic's head when Dominic was focused on the threat in the garden. Dominic didn't see him. He couldn't. In that heartbeat, Clara felt the familiar cold claw of fear, the same instinct that had made her run 9 years ago. Her mind screamed at her to find a side door, to crawl into the vents, to disappear into the night and leave this deadly world behind forever. She could run. She could be the ghost again. But as she looked at Dominic, at the man who had spent a decade drowning in his own silence just to keep her safe, the fear transformed into something sharper and more dangerous. She didn't look for an exit. She looked for a weapon. Her fingers closed around the heavy silver letter opener Dominic had left on the desk earlier. It was a decorative piece, but in the grip of a woman who had nothing left to lose, it was enough. As the assassin on the balcony adjusted his aim, Clara didn't crawl away. She surged upward, ignoring the sting of glass shards on her palms. She didn't hesitate.
She threw the heavy crystal paperweight from the desk with a desperate localized strength, shattering the lamp near the balcony and plunging the upper level into darkness. The distraction lasted only a second, but it was the second Dominic needed. He spun, his gray eyes catching the movement above, and fired twice. The assassin slumped over the railing, and the room fell into a ringing, heavy silence. Dominic didn't look at the fallen man. He looked at Clara, who was standing in the middle of the room, her hair disheveled and her hands shaking, but her gaze fixed firmly on his. She hadn't moved on. She had stepped into the light. And in that moment, the deadly game had changed forever. The ward was gone, and the partner had arrived. The ringing silence following the gunfire was broken not by a second wave of assassins, but by the heavy, frantic slamming of the study doors. Lucas burst into the room, a weapon in his hand, and a look of pure, unadulterated terror that instantly hardened into something much colder as his eyes swept the wreckage. He saw the shattered glass, the fallen gunman on the balcony, and finally, the way Dominic's hand was still curled protectively around Clara's waist. The betrayal hit Lucas with more force than any Martinez bullet could have. He stood frozen, the barrel of his gun lowering slowly as the reality of the scene took root. The steel-gray eyes of his best friend were fixed on him, not with guilt, but with a defiant, raw honesty that confirmed every suspicion Lucas had buried 9 years.
Supply lines and revenue gaps, focusing entirely on the data. For 10 minutes, she was winning. She was a professional. She was safe. Then, Dominic made his move. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back, his intense gray eyes tracking the movement of her lips rather than the charts on the screen. As she reached for a remote on the table near him, his hand shot out, not to take the device, but to rest his palm flat on the table, inches from her hip. It was a silent, territorial claim that stopped the breath in her lungs. "You missed a detail, Clara," he murmured, his eyes finally meeting hers. The lieutenants looked down at their tablets, sensing the sudden predatory shift in the atmosphere. The South Brooklyn port isn't just a logistics hub, it's a message. Tell them what kind of message it sends. Clara swallowed, her mind racing. "It signals dominance," she managed to say. "Exactly." Dominic stood, his height towering over her, forcing her to look up. He stepped into her personal space, ostensibly to point at a figure on the screen, but his jacket brushed against her arm, sending a jolt of electricity through her blazer. He leaned down, his lips ghosting past her ear so only she could hear the gravel in his tone. "And dominance requires constant reminders, don't you agree?" He reached past her, his hand lingering on the small of her back for a second too long, a blatant power move that told everyone in the room she was under his protection and told Clara she was under his thumb. The briefing continued, but the professional facade had shattered. Clara sat back down, her skin burning where he had touched her, realizing that in Dominic Thorne's world there was no such thing as just business. Every word, every look, and every shadow was a reminder. She hadn't escaped the garden, she had just moved into his throne room. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the Chicago skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the boardroom that felt less like twilight and more like a warning. Dominic remained at the head of the table, the air around him still thick with the residue of his silent claim on Clara, when the heavy doors swang open without a knock. Dominic's lead for digital security, Tyan, stepped in, his face a mask of professional urgency that instantly spiked the tension in the room. He didn't speak, he simply slid a tablet toward Dominic.
Clara, standing near the windows to catch her breath, saw Dominic's expression shift. It wasn't fear. Dominic Thorne didn't possess the mechanics for that, but his jaw tightened to a lethal edge, his gray eyes darkening until they looked like flint. "The Volkovs are overextending," Dominic said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in Clara's chest. "They've made a move on the South Brooklyn port, but this isn't a territory grab, it's a message." He turned the screen so Clara could see. It was a single high-resolution image of a Thorne Syndicate transport truck, its side painted with a sprawling crimson mark, the sigil of the Martinez Syndicate, the most ruthless mercenary group in the underworld. Below the image was a timestamp from only 10 minutes ago and a single line of text. "The King's crown is heavy. Let us help you take it off." The blood drained from Clara's face. She knew the name Martinez. Her brother had spoken of them in hushed tones before his death, describing them as the shadows that even the mafia feared, men who didn't care for honor or territory, only for the kill. "Dominic," she whispered, the professional mask finally slipping. "The Martinez group, they don't miss." Dominic stood, his presence suddenly filling the room with a cold, predatory energy. He ignored the lieutenants, his focus narrowing entirely on Clara. He saw the flicker of genuine terror in her eyes, a fear not for herself, but for him. It was the first time in 9 years he had seen her composure truly fail, and the realization hit him with more force than any threat could. "They haven't met me yet," Dominic replied, though his hand briefly brushed the leather of his holster. He stepped towards her, the proximity no longer a power move, but a silent vow of protection. The Martinez shadow had officially fallen over the Thorne estate. As the room erupted into the chaotic preparations of a syndicate going to war, Clara realized with a sickening jolt that the deadly game Victor had mentioned wasn't just a metaphor for their attraction, it was a literal countdown. For the first time she understood that the man who had spent a decade being her untouchable tormentor was, in this world, a target, and the red dot was already searching for his heart. The quiet click of the office door was more than just a sound. It was a physical weight that settled over the room, pressing the air out of Clara's lungs. Dominic leaned against the heavy wood, his arms crossed over the charcoal silk of his vest, his gray eyes pinning her to the center of the Persian rug. The Martinez threat had turned the estate into a fortress of steel and paranoia. But inside this room, the only danger Clara felt was the man blocking her exit. "Move, Dominic," she said, her voice sounding thinner than she intended. She clutched a stack of dossiers to her chest, a useless paper shield. "You have people to command. You don't have time for this." "I have exactly as much time as I decide to have. And right now, I'm deciding to find out why you're still looking at me like I'm the monster who hunted you out of that garden 9 years ago." Clara's jaw tightened. "Because you are. You're the man who ruined my relationship with the only family I had left. You're the man who sent me away."
You think you're untouchable. He thought so too, until he realized he wasn't the one holding the gun. The moment Clara Vance stepped into the path of that sniper's red laser, she knew the 5 years she'd spent hiding in the shadows of the Thorne Syndicate were over. For half a decade, she'd played the role of the invisible ward, the sister of a dead man, breathing the same air as Dominic Thorne, while pretending his cold gray eyes didn't make her blood sing. Now, under the flickering lights of the Metropolitan Gala, the predatory grace Dominic usually used to rule New York was gone.
as he caught her falling body, his tailored suit staining with the heat of her sacrifice, the sound of the ballroom doors being slammed shut by his guards echoed like a casket closing. Dominic Thorne never bowed to any man, but as he hit the marble floor to catch her, the city finally saw its king fall. If you're ready to see what happens when the most ruthless man in the underworld finally loses his composure, stay with me until the end. We're about to find out if the Ice King can survive the fire he's about to start. Don't forget to hit that like button and comment with your city. Let's see how far the Thorne Syndicate reaches tonight. The invitation had been simple: a gala, a public appearance, a chance for Dominic to remind his rivals why he owned the skyline. Clara had spent 72 hours perfecting her invisible routine, wearing a dress that blended into the silk drapes and staying 3 paces behind the man she wasn't supposed to love. It was a simple errand: stand, smile, and survive. She should have known better. Nothing involving Dominic Thorne was ever safe. The ballroom felt different tonight, stripped of its usual glamour and replaced by a suffocating tension that smelled of expensive champagne and impending blood. Clara's heels hadn't even clicked against the marble before she saw it, the tiny dancing red dot on Dominic's lapel. He was looking at his rivals, his sharp jawline set in a mask of unreadable stone. He didn't see the threat, but Clara did, and in that heartbeat, the girl who had spent 9 years running finally decided to stand her ground. The manila folder felt like lead in Clara's hands as she navigated the hushed, cavernous hallways of the Thorne estate. It was past midnight, the hour Dominic preferred for his most sensitive briefings, a time when the rest of the world slept, leaving only the predators and the ghosts awake. Dominic had been back in New York for only 3 days, yet the atmosphere of the entire city seemed to have shifted, tightening like a coil. Clara had done everything in her power to remain invisible since his return, perfecting the art of being a shadow in her own home. But tonight, duty had finally cornered her. She reached the heavy oak doors of his private quarters. This was his inner sanctum, a place she hadn't stepped foot in 5 years. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that betrayed her practiced composure. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Taking a steadying breath, she turned the handle and slipped inside, hoping to drop the documents on his desk and vanish before the air itself realized she was there. The room smelled of cedar, expensive bourbon, and the faint metallic tang of the city air. The only light came from a single green-shaded lamp on the desk, casting long skeletal shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. Clara moved quickly, her heels muffled by the thick Persian rug. She reached the desk, her hand trembling as she set the folder down, but as she turned to leave, the sound of a closing door stopped her heart. Dominic emerged from the ensuite dressing room, mid-stride, and froze. He was shirtless, his skin bronzed and mapped with the faint silver lines of scars that told the history of a decade of warfare. The light caught the sharp angle of his jawline and the lethal breadth of his shoulders. Clara's breath hitched, trapped in her throat. She had forgotten how much space he occupied, how the very molecules of the room seemed to vibrate with his presence. Dominic's intense grey eyes locked onto hers, unreadable and cold, yet burning with a sudden sharp recognition. He didn't reach for a robe or move to cover himself. Instead, he simply watched her, his gaze traveling from her wide eyes down to the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Dominic took a single step forward.
The distance between them, which she had fought so hard to maintain for 5 years, vanished in a heartbeat. He reached past her shoulder, his arm a warm weight in her periphery, and turned the lock on the door with a deliberate metallic click. "I didn't think you'd come tonight," he rasped, his voice a low vibration that thrummed through the floorboards. "But now that you're here, Clara, I think we're done running." The click of the lock still echoed in the silent room, but for Clara the bridge was to a different night, one she had spent nearly 3,000 days trying to forget. Standing inches from Dominic's bare chest, the scent of cedar and rain acted like a catalyst, dragging her back to the moonlit garden behind her brother's old estate 9 years ago. In that memory, the air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the heavy humidity of a New York summer. Clara was 19, vibrant and naive, following Dominic into the labyrinth of hedges because he was the only person who made the world feel quiet. He had been her brother's best friend, a rising prince in a world of shadows and completely off-limits. They had stopped near a stone fountain, the water's rhythmic splashing masking the sound of their breathing. Dominic had turned to her then, his grey eyes stripped of their usual steel, looking at her with a raw, terrifying hunger that made her knees weak. He hadn't said a word, he hadn't needed to. When he reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, the world narrowed to the space between their lips. It was an almost kiss, a fraction of an inch of forbidden heat that promised to rewrite her entire destiny. But the moment hadn't shattered into a kiss, it had shattered into a nightmare. "Clara!" Your brother's voice had sliced through the darkness like a blade. Lucas had appeared at the edge of the terrace, his face contorted with a mixture of shock and a betrayal so deep it looked like physical pain. That night hadn't ended in a romance, it had ended in a fractured brotherhood and a frantic exile. Lucas had seen the way his best friend looked at his sister, like she was the only thing worth saving in a dying city, and he had been terrified. He'd packed her bags the next morning, convinced that distance was the only way to protect her from the gravity of a man like Dominic Thorne. Back in the present, the hum of the Thorne estate's ventilation system pulled her back to the dimly lit study. The memory of her brother's disappointed eyes felt like a fresh wound, even as Dominic stood before her now, more dangerous and magnetic than the boy in the garden had ever been. Dominic's gaze remained fixed on her, noting the way her eyes clouded with the past. He knew exactly where she had gone. The tension between them wasn't just about the shirtless man in front of her or the locked door behind her. It was about 9 years of ghosts standing between them. "Clara, he isn't here to stop us this time," Dominic murmured, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He didn't move, yet she felt the pull of him like a physical tide, threatening to sweep away every defense she had spent a decade building. The following morning, the sweltering tension of the bedroom was replaced by the biting chill of the Thorne Syndicate's glass-walled boardroom. Clara sat at the long obsidian table, her fingers interlaced tightly to hide the tremor that hadn't left her since the click of the lock the night before. She was dressed in a sharp, high-collared blazer, a suit of armor designed to signal that she was the executive assistant, the professional, the sister of the late consigliere. Nothing more. Dominic entered the room like a cold front, followed by a wake of lieutenants who scrambled to find their seats. He no longer was the shirtless man in the shadows. He was the king of New York in a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than most men made in a year. He didn't look at her when he took the head of the table, but the air in the room instantly became scarce. "The quarterly logistics," Dominic began, his voice a low, commanding rasp that made the men around him straighten their spines. "Clara," present the Volkov territory shifts. Clara stood, her heels clicking with forced confidence as she moved to the digital display. She began to speak, her voice steady as she detailed